30 years ago, the end of the Soviet Union was hailed in the West as a new hope for human rights and more democratic rule. But 30 years later, many of the former Soviet republics are still run by governments with characteristics of authoritarian rule, something that people in Belarus have been trying to change with a long series of protests. The action also includes protests in Boston by local immigrants and other people with heritage from Belarus. Joining us are two of them, Dr. Vladislava Chalei and Joel Schwartz. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
We're glad to meet you, Vladislava. I want to start with you because you are directly from Belarus. A lot of people come here from other countries. They work hard to succeed, but they don't get so involved in what's going on with their native countries anymore. You're getting very involved here with what's going on in Belarus. Why is that?
This is a great question. Thanks for asking it. I think really for a long time, people in Belarus and the waves of immigrants that kind of emerged from there with the subsequent, if you will, almost like a 4 or 5 year cycle with every subsequent election have been sort of disillusioned and were leaving the country because they gave up on the struggle. But I think this year has been pretty unprecedented. So the diasporas came together almost for the first time in many years, because this time around, it just felt very different. It felt like this time around we have hope and we have a real broad movement, as opposed to sort of struggle by very much committed activists who've been in the movement for decades and kind of committed their lives to it. So now the diasporas are coming together, just regular people who've never been politically active in the past are coming together. I've been somewhat politically active my entire life, but I think this year has been different even for me.
Joe Schwartz, you have ancestors who lived in Belarus, and you made the trip back there. How did that shape your attitude?
Well, 3 years ago, my adult son and I decided that for the first time, we would go to the places where all 4 of my grandparents were from, 4 different places in what is now Belarus. It was the Russian Empire when they left around 1900. And, we had no connection. Like most Jews in this country with ancestors from Eastern Europe, we really had very little connection with that part of the world. And we were transformed by the trip. We felt like we were embraced by the people of Belarus. We met with people in the very tiny now Jewish communities, but they are in many parts of Belarus. We went to synagogues there, and the majority of people who are not Jewish, they all embraced us, and we learned about a country we knew so little about.
Going back to one of the problems in the former Soviet republics, maybe even in Russia itself, are rigged elections. They've had them in Ukraine. A lot of people think you had one last year with Alexander Lukashenko being kept in power. He's been in power for quite a long time. But what about the protest movement? Is this just about a rigged election, or is it more fundamental than that?
Another great question. So I think this is primarily driven by a rigged election, but this is not the first rigged election, especially with this president. So we've had the same president pretty much from the very beginning since we became a presidential republic in 1994. So he's been elected, quote unquote, with fraudulent elections for the 6th time running. And obviously, every time that election happened in the past, people were sort of outraged somewhat, but overall, they did not feel like, they had enough of a majority, if you will, to stand up to it. But this year has been many factors that came together. I think COVID is a very important one. Our government completely abdicated any responsibility for it. The president denied it publicly. He ridiculed it. While people were very much affected, they were dying in great numbers, and the numbers were suppressed. And that kind of, for the first time, triggered, if you will, the emergence of horizontal connections between people. People realized that they have to self-organize to basically just stop their relatives from dying and themselves from dying. They started, making and distributing masks, raising money, providing supplies and equipment to doctors and hospitals, etc. And then in some areas, for example, in my own native district in the west of Minsk, which is the capital, over the summer, there was the situation where there was no water. So basically the water supply just, was contaminated. The water was undrinkable, unusable entirely. And the government, again, did nothing. And people had to, again, sort of reignite those horizontal connections to then distribute water in the community. And so I think one after the other, some of these events kind of, if you will, overlapped and culminated in basically extremely rigged, not just election on the election day, but the whole campaign extremely fraught with violence and repression. So all of the three main candidates basically ended up either pushed out of the country or jailed. And so that was basically just sort of that was bringing the country to the boiling point. And then the night of the 9th of August was just the, if you will, the fire to the match. So, and everything ignited.
Joel, the Russian government is getting involved here. They're going to be offering Lukashenko a lot of money. They want him to put on some semblance of reform that might move at a very, very slow pace. So what should the American government be doing?
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to just mention one thing about your last question, because when we were there 3 years ago, we would meet with the various Belarusians in different parts of the country, and we'd say, so what do you think about your political system here? And they'd almost in every case say, oh, we have this horrible dictator, we hate him, but what can you do? I mean, he controls the army, he controls the police, he'll throw you in jail or kill you if you step out of line. And now everything has been transformed. Those attitudes are part of the past, not the present. And so I've been riveted by this movement that has changed things so much. But to answer your question, up till now, the United States government has done a few things, but very little, in fact, to put pressure on the Lukashenko regime. However, we have a new president now, and he in the campaign is committed to democracy around the world, and he specifically talked about Belarus. On top of that, in December, this didn't make the big headlines, in the omnibus spending bill that was signed at the end of December is a part called the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights, and Sovereignty Act that outlines a whole range of strong measures that the president can take to put pressure for democracy in Belarus. So the Biden administration has some very strong tools, and our job is to make sure that he uses them in the most effective way possible. And we've been talking with Senator Markey. He actually sent a message of support at our rally on Saturday as well, and with others too, to make sure that that happens.
Vlada, this week in Minsk, there is a so-called People's Assembly, maybe some talk of a long exit plan for Lukashenko, but you're having an event here in Boston. I guess that's a response to what's going on in Belarus.
That's right, yes, there is this attempt, if you will, to codify this completely unconstitutional quote-unquote assembly, basically just a bunch of functionaries, various bureaucrats just appointed pretty much to be part of that assembly and give that assembly the right of a constitutional lawmaking, if you will, basically allowing them to propose so-called new constitutional project or new constitutional draft, and then somehow then push the approval of that new constitution through that same type of assembly in the future. It's very difficult to tell right now what exactly the plan is. People were suspecting that he might want to kind of just juggle around responsibilities across the three branches of government that currently pretty much do not exist because he has control over all three. Maybe he will sort of nominally spread them, but give himself some way of still retaining that control. It's just really difficult to tell. But I think more than anything else, this is just a game for time. He's just playing to kind of keep in power as long as possible, to just wear down the freedom movement through repression, and anything goes in that game, right? Just trying to sit on that chair for as long as possible, and then proposing some fictitious initiatives.
Joel, what are the other events coming up? And I think this is going to be in March. You have a special date you want to commemorate. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a great one. So Belarusian independence or sovereignty kind of goes back all the way to, if you will, almost like medieval Renaissance times. We had the Great Duchy of Lithuania or Litva, and the Commonwealth with the Polish crown in the past, but our sort of most closely resembling state structure to the current, if you will, borders of modern day Belarus happened in 1918, like Joel mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, and that is when in 1918, a group of people got together, formed a government on the back of basically a revolution that was happening at the time, and declared independence. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. Civil war that the Communist Party unleashed after the revolution, obviously, swamped all of that. But for some period of time, briefly, we had that independent state that we declared, and since then we commemorate that day, the 25th of March, as so-called Liberty Day, and that is sort of symbolic in the democratic movement in Belarus as the day of de facto independence.
Joel, you're going to be involved in that too, right?
Oh yeah, it's very important. Our event will be on March 27th, that's Saturday, right around that date. And it's part of this community here continuing action to, on one hand, show support for this very vibrant movement. And I'll mention, there's some things about this movement that have totally inspired me. One, it's primarily led by women. Obviously, you see Vladislava here, and she's one of the leaders, at least on this in this part of the world. But over there, the leader at the very top is a woman, and on the streets, the leaders are women, really confronting this dictatorship. Secondly, it has been completely dedicated to nonviolence against all sorts of violence inflicted on it by the government. But it has maintained nonviolent discipline, and it's been inspiring in many ways to me. So we want to show support. And again, we're going to call on the Biden administration. Hopefully, he will have taken some measures by then, and we'll applaud them and call on him and his administration to take further measures, because this is not going away. The other thing I'll mention is, the core of this group certainly are immigrants from Belarus, like Vladislava. But then there are other people like me who wasn't born in Belarus, but has ties to this country. And beyond that, I'm sure there are many, and there are many Americans who want to support democracy and certainly take a stand against dictatorship. So we are welcoming any and all Americans here who want to join us in supporting democracy.
Finally, Vladislav, what you're also trying to do here is some direct aid to Belarus as well. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
That's correct. Yeah, so as we already discussed at length, our diasporas have been coming together to show symbolic support, and has been really well received and well taken and appreciated back home in Belarus. We've had all these mass rallies, etc., happening all over the United States, and they've been covered in the independent press in Belarus. But I think more than anything else, what is really important is to sort of flex, if you will, the economic power and the political connections, etc., of the diaspora, and channel all of those resources to support people on the ground in Belarus. It's impossible to topple a regime as entrenched and as violent as the one that we have in Belarus without activists on the ground who need resources. And it's not a rich country, right? It's a very resource constrained country, and the laws, especially as far as protecting workers, are so eroded and basically non-existent that it's just very difficult for people to say even go on strike because they don't have means to feed their families. So one of the examples of that support is Belarusian diaspora here in Boston initiated a project where we basically connected with the striking, a group of striking workers in one of the factories in the Western region. And we're working with the strike committee to support the families of those who went on strike, who were fired for their political or social civic beliefs. And we initiated almost a chain reaction of that. So now The diasporas in New York, in Seattle, in Philadelphia, in San Francisco, now the diaspora in Holland are all kind of picking up the same flag. They've linked up with other factories or initiatives on the ground in Belarus, and they now raising pretty significant amounts of money to support those people and basically make sure that the activists can stay in Belarus, don't have to immigrate, and stay safe, have resources to keep the good fight.
Finally, and I think maybe this should go to you, Vladislava, if people want more information about the events in Boston, you got a Facebook page that people can check out?
That's right. And I think Joel has the QR code that
And Joel,
yes,
very good, Joel, always prepared here.
maybe just lift it up a little bit because it's cut off. But yes, so we have the Facebook group that's called Belarusians in Boston. It's in English, so you can just type it in the Facebook search. And we have, when you go to that page, obviously you're very welcome to join the community. All the announcements about all the events are there. And there is constant information about that project that I just outlined to support the striking workers. So you're obviously very welcome to donate, contribute ideas, contribute energy. We are really grateful and appreciative.
Right. Well, I thank both of you for taking the time to bring us up to date and explain to us who are not familiar with the story, Vladislava Chalei and Joel Schwartz.
Thank you.
We'll have more news in just a moment.